Dan Richards runs the YouTube channel Dedunking. He and I have had a couple of cordial exchanges on Twitter which were without incident, though he did casually refer to me as lad, which was ironic given he's a few years younger than I am, but I wouldn't expect him to know that. On the 12th of July 2024, Dan published a video in which he commented on a journal paper cited in an online article by Forbes magazine. The journal paper was on the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, which Dan explains is, quote, the theory that a comet burst above the northern ice sheets around 12,800 years ago and caused all kinds of extinctions and whatnot, end quote. Well, some people think it was a comet, some think it was a meteor or something else, and it has been proposed to explain the dramatic climate change which started what is called the Younger Dryas period. But that's just extra detail. Dan summarizes the hypothesis quite succinctly. Reading the Forbes article itself, we find the paper was, quote, published in the journal Air Bursts and Cratering, end quote, and apparently provides evidence for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis in the form of, quote, platinum, melt glass, and shock fractured quartz, all suggesting the kind of forces and high temperatures associated with air burst comets, end quote. The journal's full title is actually Air Bursts and Cratering Impacts. The journalist just misnamed it slightly. Now, I probably don't have to tell you that science reporting in mainstream media is notoriously unreliable, typically sensationalized, exaggerated, and misleading. So how do we know if this journal paper is a reliable scientific report? Well, you might think that since the Forbes article reporting on it has already passed Forbes' editorial board, then they've checked to see if the paper was reliable. Or you might think that since the Forbes article was written by Jamie Carter, a freelance science journalist with expertise in astronomy, he would have the expertise to check if the paper was reliable. Additionally, you might think that the article's reliability has been assured by the journal which published it. This is definitely how Dan sees it. Several times in his video, Dan stresses the fact that this article was published in a peer-reviewed journal, and that generally is a good indication that an article has some merit, since it has passed through a process of formal academic review. Why would you ever distrust a peer-reviewed journal? Isn't peer review the gold standard for quality in academia? Aren't we always being told to rely on peer-reviewed scholarly literature instead of personal opinions and non-scholarly sources? So there are 3 apparently good reasons to trust this journal article. Now I'm going to show you why you shouldn't trust it, and in the process, we'll learn how to be properly critical of peer-reviewed scholarly literature. We're also going to see that peer review doesn't always mean what you might think it means. Assessing the journal. Before I do anything else, I'll visit the Retraction Watch database and see if the article is there. Retraction Watch is a site owned by the Center for Scientific Integrity, a research organization dedicated to exactly what it says in the name. If I find the paper in the Retraction Watch database, that means the authors have withdrawn the paper from circulation, either because they found it had errors disqualifying its publication, or because the journal's editorial board has found or has been advised of such errors. I use a bibliographic data index program called Zotero, in which I store all the bibliographic information for my sources, including any PDFs I download. And one of its best features is that any papers I save are periodically scanned by Zotero using the Retraction Watch database, and they're immediately flagged in Zotero if they've been retracted, presenting a large red warning when this happens. It's a very useful tool since sometimes I've actually seen that warning pop up on papers in my Zotero index, though fortunately no papers I've trusted, only those I've already identified as questionable. Entering the journal article's title into the Retraction Watch database, I find it returns the result, no retractions found matching selected criteria. That's a good start. At least this means the article has survived its first 8 months of publication. Now we'll need to do a lot more work. I don't have any knowledge or qualifications relevant to the topic of this article, so I'll beg your patience while I take you with me through a step-by-step process of assessing the paper's reliability and explain my concerns about the journal's metrics and concerns about the journal's review process. Concerns about the journal's metrics. I'm going to start by visiting the journal's website to check specific metrics. I'm pleased to find the journal, Air Bursts and Cratering Impacts, on scienceopen.com, a website which hosts open access journals, meaning they are made publicly available on the site so anyone can read them without having to pay a fee. This makes everything a lot easier. I'm a complete fan of open access, and I've published in an open access journal myself. In the screenshot now on screen, you can see a few of the journal's metrics. It has only 12 publications, meaning 12 individual papers, which is only a tiny number, so maybe the journal is new. Its most viewed paper has 250,446 views as of the date of writing this script, the 13th of January 2025, but that doesn't mean much since the number of views a paper has received is no indicator of its quality. The highest alt metric any of its papers has received is 445, but again, that doesn't mean much since alt metrics are only an indicator of the amount of online attention a paper has received. Again, no indicator of quality. The journal has no reviews, only 5 recommends, 103 shares, and 11 followers, which might mean something if the journal is at least a decade old, but probably just means this journal was only started recently. And yes, checking the journal's data, we find it was first published in September 2023, so it's not even 2 years old yet. At the top of my screenshot, you might notice a line of text saying, "There are 7 articles on this page with pub peer comments." We won't investigate that yet since we're interested in the journal at present, but make a note of it since we'll be returning to it later. Before we leave this page, let's look at the journal's self-description. It's long and detailed, which is good, and I'll read out a few key statements. First, we're told, quote, "Our journal collection, Airbursts and Cratering Impacts, covers all aspects of impact events on the Earth by comets and asteroids," end quote. Okay, that's useful to know. Later, we're told why the journal was started, and part of the motivation was to overcome the problem that many more papers are written than journals have time or resources to review and publish, meaning a great deal of research which could be useful just can't get a platform. This is a real problem in academia, and it's a valid reason to start a new journal. After that, we read, quote, "Even more problematic, biased reviewers often act as gatekeepers to prevent novel discoveries from being published to the detriment of scientific progress," end quote. Okay, that certainly can happen, but I'm a little wary of the claim that happens often and that biased reviewers aim to prevent novel discoveries from being published. That does sound like the kind of conspiratorial thinking which fringe academics and pseudoscientists indulge in when their papers are rejected for perfectly good reasons. But I'll give that a pass for now and read on. Usefully, there's a detailed comment about the journal's review process, which starts by saying, quote, "We are helping to counter this trend by utilizing a multi-tiered peer review process with both single-blind and open review components as follows," end quote. This sounds good. Multi-tiered peer review means each paper passes through several rounds of scrutiny, and single-blind and open review are 2 standard methods journals use to assess papers for publication. I'm a little surprised that double-blind peer review isn't used, since it's the gold standard for journals, while single-blind review is vulnerable to bias since the reviewers know the identity of the author, and the weakness of open review is that it allows non-specialists to assess the paper and contribute to its chance of publication, even if the reviewers are insufficiently qualified to do so. But we'll leave this for now and look at some other metrics. I'll look up the journal in the Clarivate Web of Science Master Journal List, a curated database of the best science journals. Unfortunately, it isn't there. That doesn't necessarily mean it's low quality. It might simply be because it's too new to have been indexed. So now I'll look for it on Scimago Journal and Country Rank, a website listing scholarly journals and their critical metrics, including their impact factor. Unfortunately, it isn't there. So now I'll look for it in the directory of open access journals. Well, unfortunately, it's not there either. So now I'll look for it on XLA, a non-profit organization indexing journals, and yes, this time I found a report on the journal, and unfortunately, it's not good news. At the time this database indexed the journal, it had 11 articles, so that's pretty recent, given it only has 12 now. The journal's papers have received only 16 citations. That's extremely low even for a single journal paper, let alone for 11 papers. The journal's H-index is only 3 and the G-index is only 4, and for a good science journal, these numbers should be 20 and up. The impact factor is 0 when it should be at least close to 5. As a point of reference, the open access scholarly journal Scientific Reports, the 5th most cited journal in the world, in which papers both supporting and disputing the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis have been published, and in fact in which some of the authors of this paper have had their work published, has an impact factor of 3.8, an H index of 315, and 734,000 citations just in 2023. It's 12 years older than airbursts and cratering impacts, but its presence in the scholarly community is already disproportionately orders of magnitude greater. All those numbers measure how much other scholars are citing the journal's articles, either to support them, dispute them, or use them for further research. The impact factor is a rough guide, and I do mean rough, you can't rely on an impact factor completely, to how much influence the journal has in its subject area. And right now, that level of influence is basically nothing. The impact factor is literally 0. These numbers indicate this journal has been pretty much ignored by scholarship so far. Concerns about the journal's review process. Let's look at the journal's review process in more detail. The journal's homepage tells us the process consists of 3 steps. Quote, first, the article is internally reviewed by our expert editorial board members and guest editors. End quote. Well, let's see who these editors are. Cord Ernstson, James Powell, Kenneth Tankersley, Martin Sweatman, Malcolm LeCompte, Christopher Moore, and Alan West. I spent some time looking up the academic details of these editors, and I found all of them accept the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. The entire editorial board is in agreement with this view. So how do you think they're going to assess an article arguing for evidence supporting the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis? Will they be biased in favor of accepting it because they accept it? Or will they put all their bias aside and reject the paper if it doesn't provide sufficient evidence? How could we ever know? Let's look at this another way. How many papers have the editors published in their journal which dispute this hypothesis? None. In fact, all 12 papers published by the journal so far are papers claiming to support the hypothesis with evidence. So the journal has been running for less than 2 years, and the only papers it has published so far are those supporting the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. The journal has published no papers critiquing the hypothesis and no papers on any other subject. I wonder if that's anything to do with the fact that the journal, quote, encourages submissions, end quote, from papers which, quote, run counter to a prevailing view, end quote, and, quote, have been rejected by other journals, end quote. It's not unusual for a journal to publish a paper which has been rejected by another journal, but it is unusual for a journal to actually invite papers which have been rejected by other journals, especially in science. Let's make a note of that and move on. We are also told, quote, second, the board will invite single-blind reviewers to comment on the article. Previous reviews from submissions rejected by other journals are also considered and given the same weight as current reviews, end quote. As I mentioned previously, a single-blind process isn't as vigorous as the double-blind process typically used by scholarly journals, since it means although the authors don't know the identity of the reviewers know the identity of the authors and may therefore be influenced by this. We're also told, quote, our commitment is to rarely reject submissions outright, but rather to work with authors through multiple revisions until a manuscript is acceptable for publication. This assures that groundbreaking discoveries will be published rather than suppressed and are widely available to readers at no cost, end quote. That sounds reasonable, though the term suppressed is a bit loaded. We are then told, quote, third, the article will undergo a non-anonymous post-publication review in which an article's quality and impact are judged by comments from the scientific community at large, by its number of downloads, by its altmetric score, and by its number of citations, end quote. As a post-publication review process, this isn't too bad, though I would question the relevance of the number of downloads and the altmetric score as an indicator of anything other than social media interest in the paper, rather than scholarly interest. At least they say the article's quality and impact will be, quote, judged by comments from the scientific community at large, end quote. Let's make a note of that. Later, we'll see if we can find any comments on this paper from the scientific community at large. What else can we find out about this journal? Perhaps there's a notice of its commencement. I'll just type Start of Airbursts and Cratering Impacts Journal into Google and see what happens. The 7th hit on the front page of the search results is an article entitled "Comet Research Group Kicks Off New Journal with Blockbuster Papers." Let's read that and see what it says. We're in luck, since it is indeed describing the start of the Air Bursts and Cratering Impacts journal, and we're told a lot about the motivation behind the journal's creation. Quote, "As many followers of the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis are aware, publishing information from the Comet Research Group concerning man's most significant episode has always been difficult. Some papers have required 4 years to pass the so-called peer review and be published, while others, once published, have sustained repeated baseless nuisance appeals for their retraction. Each of the new papers this week was subjected to a rigorous review from hostile academic cliques for years." End quote. Notice how the author addresses, quote, "followers of the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis," end quote. That means the article is speaking directly to people who already accept the hypothesis. The author says getting information about the hypothesis published has, quote, "always been difficult," end quote, citing lengthy, quote, "so-called peer review," end quote. The term so-called peer review is a red flag to me. That indicates the author doesn't think these papers have received proper peer review, and that's why they've been rejected. The author also tells us that even when papers have been published, they've been, quote, "subjected to a rigorous review from hostile academic cliques for years," end quote. Well, no one should object to rigorous review, but hostile academic cliques is very loaded language, implying the reviewers are simply gatekeeping their field and rejecting ideas they don't like on spurious grounds. This might be a factual statement, or it might be an expression of frustration by someone whose pet scientific theory is consistently rejected by the overwhelming majority of specialists in relevant fields. Very tellingly, the article also tells us, quote, "Over time, it became clear that the effort required to publish in established but biased journals wasn't worth it, leading to the decision to start a new online journal that would be thoroughly peer-reviewed. That new journal is Air Bursts and Cratering Impacts," end quote. Combining all the information we now have, we know that the Air Bursts and Cratering Impacts journal was created specifically to publish articles supporting the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. All its editorial board members support the hypothesis. Submissions to the journal are primarily reviewed by supporters of the hypothesis. The journal has only published papers supporting the hypothesis and none on any other subject. The journal has not published any papers opposing the hypothesis. The journal has a suboptimal review process, and the journal accepts articles which have already been rejected by mainstream peer-reviewed journals which have a high academic standing. Now, these are all red flags, and this combination of all of them is a very large and serious red flag. Everything we've seen so far indicates this journal was created specifically to provide supporters of the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis a sympathetic platform ensuring their views will be published, enabling them to claim their work has been published in a peer-reviewed journal, and granting them the credibility denied to them by the broader scholarly community, while insulating them from the requirements of true academic peer review. There's a useful blog article on this tactic by physicist and climate scientist Dr. Victor Venema entitled "Peer Review Helps Fringe Ideas Gain Credibility," which explains that the journal Pattern Recognition in Physics was closed by its publisher because, quote, "they hardly published anything about pattern recognition," end quote. What did they publish instead? Well, they published papers casting doubt on the scientific consensus on the human responsibility for climate change. The journal was created to give peer-reviewed credibility to fringe, unscientific views, and the journal's name was simply a cover for its real purpose. This was stated very bluntly by Copernicus Publications, the company which published the journal, when issuing the termination notice, which stated, quote, "The journal idea was brought to Copernicus' attention and was taken rather critically in the beginning, since the designated editors-in-chief were mentioned in the context of the debates of climate skeptics. However, the initiators asserted that the aim of the journal was to publish articles about patterns recognized in the full spectrum of physical disciplines, rather than to focus on climate research-related topics," end quote. The notice explained that in addition to publishing a paper directly challenging the scientific consensus on climate change, quote, "the editors selected the referees on a nepotistic basis, which we regard as malpractice in scientific publishing and not in accordance with our publication ethics we expect to be followed by the editors." End quote. In this context, referees selected on a nepotistic basis means the reviewers of papers submitted to the journal were selected specifically because they were known to be sympathetic to the paper's conclusions. We've seen the entire editorial board of the Air Bursts and Cratering Impacts journal is supportive of the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, and we've also seen that the journal has only published papers on the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, and those papers only ever support the hypothesis. The case for nepotistic bias in this journal is very strong. Concerns about the journal's integrity. Before we move on and look at the journal article itself, let's read one more excerpt from that article announcing the journal, which by the way was written by a co-founder of the Comet Research Group. We're told, quote, "A notable metric for the Comet Research Group is the number of downloads their papers receive. The Tall El-Hammam paper is arguably the most read scientific article of popular interest in recent years, boasting 588,000 downloads." End quote. There are two very bright red flags here. The first is that this co-founder of the Comet Research Group thinks that the number of downloads their papers receive is a, quote, "notable metric," end quote. They don't mention citations of their papers in peer-reviewed journals or other scholarly literature, just downloads. That shows where their priorities lie: social media attention rather than scholarly processes and the broader scholarly community. The second red flag is that the group's most frequently downloaded paper, a Tunguska-sized airburst destroyed Tall El-Hammam, a Middle Bronze Age city in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea, published in the respectable scholarly journal Scientific Reports, is one which received an absolutely scathing peer review across the scholarly community after it was published, and which the journal's editors required the authors to modify repeatedly in response to serious errors found in it. The papers page on the journal website showed how this continued for a year. We can see these notes on the paper, which say, quote, "An author correction to this article was published on the 22nd of February 2022. Matters arising to this article was published on the 25th of March 2022. An author correction to this article was published on the 22nd of May 2023. 15th of February 2023 editor's note. Readers are alerted that concerns raised about the data presented and the conclusions of this article are being discussed by the editors. A further editorial response will follow the resolution of these issues." End quote. Note that when mentioning this paper very proudly, this co-founder of the Comet Research Group never mentions any of this criticism and the numerous changes the authors were required to correct it. Now we need to talk about PubPeer. This is a non-profit website enabling readers of journal papers to link to those papers and post comments on them, either critical or supportive, providing a public space for post-publication peer review, which is much faster than writing a critical journal paper and waiting for it to be reviewed and published. Comments are moderated and are required to be courteous and provide evidence for any claims made. If you look at the PubPeer page for the Comet Research Group's prized paper about the possibility of an airburst impact over Tell El-Hammam, you will find a massive 156 pages of commentary spanning 2021 to 2024. Scholars identified numerous errors and problems with the paper, including lack of a scientific model, images with misleading labels and captions, misrepresentation of the work of other scholars, failure of the authors to disclose conflicting interests, and image manipulation which broke the guidelines of the journal in which the paper was published. You might be surprised that the paper actually refers to the site as Tall El-Hammam rather than Tell El-Hammam, but don't worry about that, it's just an alternative spelling. The month after this paper was published in the Scientific Reports journal, the journal's editors published a Matters Arising statement in which they explained in detail that the paper had failed to establish its case and had presented, quote, "no mineralogic or geochemical evidence of impact at Tall El-Hammam," end quote. Much more could be written about this paper alone, and you can find plenty of additional commentary on it in the articles in my list of sources linked in the video description. However, the reason why I'm raising it is that the editors of the journal we're examining, Air Bursts and Cratering Impacts, have not only published another paper in their own journal citing this paper as having proved its case, despite its overwhelming rejection by the scientific community, but is proudly advertising it as a resounding success without even mentioning any of the numerous critical comments and problems identified in the paper, and without mentioning that the journal in which it was originally published explicitly identified it as having failed to prove its case. We'll look at what this means for the journal's integrity in more detail later. So now we know a lot more about the Air Bursts and Cratering Impacts journal and its editorial board, and it's very clear that both of them are untrustworthy. The editorial board members all accept their Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis and use their journal to publish papers supporting it. They have only published papers supporting it, never published any challenging it, and haven't published papers on any other subject. They also fail to mention serious criticism of the papers they publish. It is transparent that the journal was created specifically to provide supporters of the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis a sympathetic platform, ensuring their views will be published, enabling them to claim their work has been published in a peer-reviewed journal, and granting them the credibility denied to them by the broader scholarly community, while insulating them from the requirements of true academic peer review. Assessing the paper. Having identified the serious problems with the journal which published the paper Dan recommended, let's look at the paper itself. Maybe it will be a high-quality paper despite the problems with the journal. Maybe that's why Dan recommended it. Or maybe Dan didn't investigate the journal or the paper and recommended it because he also believes in the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, which is an integral part of his personal belief in the land of Atlantis, and he likes the paper because it is supporting something he already believes. We'll return to that later, but for now, let's look at the paper. I'll explain my concerns about author conflicts of interest, concerns about how the paper was reviewed, and concerns about individual authors. Concerns about how the paper was reviewed. Remember when I noted that this paper had a PubPeer notification on it when I viewed it in my web browser? That's because I have the PubPeer browser extension, which alerts me when a paper has received PubPeer comments. So let's go to PubPeer and look at the comments on the version of the paper as it was published in the Air Bursts and Cratering Impacts journal. There are only a few of them, probably because this journal is so small. However, the comments here are important. One of the comments questions the editorial process, observing, quote, "This paper claims it was received, revised, and accepted on the same day. That all of the authors had the opportunity to review the revisions that were requested and resubmit the final draft in one day is astonishing," end quote. Bear in mind that it's common for papers submitted to journals to take weeks to review and even months to be reviewed, revised in response, reviewed again, revised again, and then finally accepted. Having a paper received, reviewed, revised, and accepted all on the same day is extraordinary, to say the least. PubPeer allows authors of the papers being commented on a permanent right of reply, and in this case, one of the authors, Alan West, responded, explaining that the review process had been accelerated since the journal takes into account prior reviews of the paper when it has been submitted to other journals. According to West, quote, "This paper was submitted to 2 independent international journals and was reviewed by 7 anonymous reviewers," end quote. West added, quote, "4 of those reviews were positive and 3 were negative," end quote. He then explained that when the paper was submitted to the Air Bursts and Cratering Impacts journal, the editors took into account the 4 positive reviews and the fact that the authors had, quote, "revised the paper according to the recommendations of all 7 reviewers," end quote. Consequently, West explained, quote, "The editor reviewed the paper the same day and approved it for publication with no changes based on 4 positive reviews," end quote. So the editors assessed the paper largely on the basis of the previous reviews, and the 4 positive reviews were particularly influential. Given the paper was received and accepted on the same day, and the fact that no revisions were requested, it's clear the review process couldn't have taken very long at all. This didn't entirely satisfy the commenter, who questioned the review process further. They wrote another comment saying, quote, "I am not aware of any legitimate journal that accepts a manuscript for publication that was peer-reviewed by other journals and rejected without subjecting it to further independent review and even more scrutiny than usual. That your journal did this risks putting the journal into the category of what people sometimes refer to as a predatory journal, end quote. The commenter further added, quote, readers have evidence that the journal did not subject the manuscript to peer review, as it was accepted on the same day as submission, but have no evidence that the authors fixed the issues raised by the previous peer review process. If the authors had been able to fix the issues, the more typical outcome is for the authors to resubmit the issues to the same journals with the requested revisions. That this wasn't done here raises legitimate questions about the rigor and independence of the peer review, especially as this journal seems controlled by one of the authors, end quote. These are very reasonable concerns. The journal shows no evidence of having followed correct professional academic peer review process, and from what we already know about the journal and the group which owns it, there's an obvious reason for this. The group wants to avoid the standard scholarly peer review process. Concerns about individual authors. Now I want to look at the individual authors of the paper, and there are 25 of them. 25 authors for a single paper might seem unusual, and it's certainly not common in some fields, but it's quite typical in other fields. There are both valid and invalid reasons why a paper might credit a large number of authors. In terms of valid reasons, it could be that the paper received multidisciplinary contributions, meaning it's a collaborative effort of researchers in several different fields, combining their research to write the paper. This is a good thing because instead of being restricted to one or two perspectives, the paper benefits from multiple authors, each of whom provides independent lines of evidence supporting the paper, which can help substantiate its claims. However, that paper we looked at earlier on an airburst over Tel El Hammam had 20 authors, and it turned out to be very low quality, so a large number of authors certainly isn't a guarantee of good research. In terms of invalid reasons for a large number of authors, it's fairly common for well-known, respected, even famous authors to sometimes agree for their name to be placed on a paper even if they didn't contribute much to it, and in fact, sometimes even if they didn't contribute anything to it, in order to give it a greater air of authority. Even less ethically, sometimes a respected academic's name will be added to the paper completely without their knowledge, especially if they didn't work on it at all, for the same reason. This is one of the reasons for the double-blind peer review process, so reviewers aren't unduly influenced by the identity of a paper's authors. In this case, none of the invalid reasons seems to apply to this paper, which is good, but I do have other concerns. The paper identifies the author's various contributions. We're told, quote, all authors reviewed and approved the manuscript, end quote. 3 authors, quote, conceived and directed the project, end quote. 6 authors, quote, wrote the manuscript, end quote. And 23 authors, quote, contributed data and technical analysis for the paper, end quote. Clearly, some authors fulfilled more than one of these roles, but most of the work was done by Christopher R. Moore, Malcolm A. Lecomte, and Alan West, who were responsible for conception and direction, as well as involved in both review and approval, and writing the manuscript. Christopher R. Moore has a PhD in geoscience and works at the University of South Carolina Institute for Archaeology and Anthropology. Malcolm A. Lecomte has a PhD in astrophysical, planetary, and atmospheric sciences and works at the Elizabeth City State University Center of Excellence in Remote Sensing Research and Education. Those are relevant qualifications for contributing to this paper, and remember, this is a multidisciplinary work, so having authors from a range of quite different specialist areas is to be expected. Alan West is a mystery. I checked his ResearchGate profile, which is where thousands of academics list their qualifications, affiliations, and work, but although it has a photo which is apparently of him, and although he is credited with 106 publications, there's a lot of information missing. He is listed as having a PhD, but the subject is not revealed. He is listed as being affiliated with the Comet Research Group, which makes sense since he was a co-founder, but he has no other listed affiliations, whether academic or commercial. Neither his place of work nor the universities where he studied his undergraduate and postgraduate degrees are listed. The earliest paper attributed to him dates to 2009, which is unusual since the photo representing him shows a middle-aged man in at least his late 40s who should have been publishing work for nearly 30 years, not merely 15. At the very least, there should be a record of his PhD thesis, since these are recorded publicly by universities and often made publicly available for download or online reading. This is all very unusual and a concern given West's prominent role in the direction and writing of this paper. However, I did find another work for which West is credited, a 2006 book called The Cycle of Cosmic Catastrophes: How a Stone Age Comet Changed the Course of World Culture, which was apparently co-authored by West, Simon Warwick Smith, and Richard B. Firestone, and published by Bear and Company, a non-academic trade press which publishes books on mysticism, mythology, and spirituality. The company's own statement says proudly, quote, "Many experts recognizable from the Ancient Aliens television series have chosen to publish with Bear and Company, including Zachariah Stidgen, Andrew Collins, and Michael Tellinger, among others." End quote. This is not exactly what I would expect from a scientific researcher, and being associated with the Ancient Aliens TV series certainly doesn't add to his credibility. I mentioned that Richard B. Firestone was a co-author of this paper, which is noteworthy since he is also credited as being a co-author of the paper we're examining. At least Firestone's academic pedigree is far more transparent than West's. He had a PhD in nuclear chemistry from Michigan State University and worked in the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory's Isotopes Project, so he was certainly qualified for a contribution to this paper, regardless of his less scientifically robust beliefs. He died in 2024, aged 78. Having looked at the list of authors, the first part of the paper I'll look at is the conflicts of interest statement. We already saw that a previous paper written by members of the Comet Research Group, which owns this journal, was published without declaring several facts representing a conflict of interest which could have influenced the paper's results. In this case, there's a clear conflict of interest statement in the paper, and it's pretty revealing. We're told, quote, "All co-authors may receive reimbursements from their respective organizations for attending symposia on the research presented in this paper," end quote. That means the authors might be paid for attending academic gatherings based on the research in the paper, so they will definitely benefit financially from its publication. We're also told one author, quote, "is an author and co-editor of one book on Southeastern archaeology and receives royalties," end quote, and two others, quote, "are co-authors of The Cycle of Cosmic Catastrophes, a book related to the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis," end quote, which we already knew. So these two authors, Firestone and West, not only accept the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, which in itself is not a conflict of interest, they also earn money from a book promoting the hypothesis, which is a potential conflict of interest since they stand to benefit financially the more the hypothesis is accepted by academia and promoted publicly. We're also told one of the authors, quote, "donates all proceeds to the non-profit Comet Research Group," end quote. Yes, one of the authors donates all of the proceeds of their book sales to the organization which owns the journal to which they have submitted a paper. When you have an author being published in a journal owned by the organization to which the author regularly pays money, that's definitely a conflict of interest. 3 of the authors are also editors of the actual journal to which the paper was submitted, though they say they, quote, "played no role in accepting, rejecting, or reviewing the paper," end quote. Now, obviously, you can believe that or not, and personally, I think it's very likely these individuals did not have any role in the review or publishing process of the paper they submitted, and it's commendable that they acknowledged this conflict of interest. Nevertheless, when journals favor papers affiliated with their own publishing institutions, whether universities, think tanks, or special interest groups, that's a kind of academic nepotism. The Comet Research Group owned the journal in which these papers were published, and the journal overwhelmingly favors papers by members of the Comet Research Group, so it's hard for the journal to avoid a legitimate charge of academic nepotism. Now, Dan may not think any of this is a big deal, and he may consider these conflicts of interest to be inconsequential, but it's clear the authors themselves felt it necessary to mention these conflicts of interest, and I do think Dan should have mentioned them as well when he recommended the paper, in fairness to his audience. I've certainly seen him be far more skeptical of papers which didn't have such issues, and if this was a paper being appealed to by an archaeologist on a point Dan disagreed with, and he knew about these issues, I'm absolutely certain he would reject the paper outright, condemn the journal for its practices, and spend some time telling us how corrupt mainstream academia is and that we can't trust professional archaeologists. If he didn't know of these conflicts of interest with the paper, that's fair enough, but it would mean he didn't scrutinize the paper very closely. The next part of the paper I'm going to look at is the limitations section. This is the section of a paper in which the authors acknowledge weaknesses of their work by describing the constraints on it and any effects those constraints have had, which may have reduced the reliability of their work. Unfortunately, this paper doesn't have one. It's important to note that not all academic journals require a limitations section, so its absence isn't necessarily an indication that the authors are concealing inconvenient information or that their work is flawed. However, a limitations section is good practice, especially since it demonstrates the author's self-reflection on their work. Two other sections I'll look for are the data availability section, which identifies where the paper's raw data has been made publicly available for other researchers, and the sample availability section, which identifies whether or not the authors are able to provide raw samples of the physical materials they examined. The raw samples may not always be available, but the raw data always should be. This provides other researchers with the ability to test the paper's findings by doing the same experiments and seeing if they can replicate the results, which is extremely important in post-publication peer review. Happily, in this case, we're told both are available, though we're also told, quote, samples from the Younger Dryas boundary layer are mostly depleted, but limited amounts may be available from the corresponding author, end quote. Now, you might note that thus far I haven't examined the paper's actual hypothesis, test methodology, results, analysis, and conclusions, and you might think that's what I'm going to look at next, but I'm not. Why not? Because I'm simply unqualified to do so, and I probably wouldn't understand most of what I was reading. Instead, I'll look for post-publication peer review by specialists who are qualified to assess the paper professionally. Wider scholarly reception. Remember the journal said articles it published will be, quote, judged by comments from the scientific community at large, end quote, as part of the post-publication review process? That's entirely valid, so let's look at concerns about the paper's content which have been raised by other scholars. We've already looked at the pub peer comments and seen how the authors have responded to those, so where else can we look? Well, let's see if this paper has been cited anywhere else. Looking at the paper's record in Science Open, I can see it has been cited only 3 times by 3 separate papers. Let's see who wrote those and where they were published. It turns out that all 3 of these citations are in papers published in 2024, and all 3 papers were also published in the Airbursts and Cratering Impacts Journal, the same journal which published the paper under examination. These papers have several of the same authors as the paper we're looking at. This is a classic case of self-citation, which is not intrinsically bad, but in this case I think it's being misused. It's clear the wider scholarly community has not taken any notice of the paper we're looking at, and the only times it has been cited have been by other papers in the same journal sharing one or more of the same authors who are self-citing to boost its citation rating and their own and the journal's own impact factor. One of the reasons why I think this is that there's evidence for authors of this paper citing some of their previous work as if it was rigorous research, despite it having been comprehensively rejected by the scholarly community. For example, the Airbursts and Cratering Impacts Journal has published a paper entitled Modelling How a Powerful Airburst Destroyed Tall El Hammam, a Middle Bronze Age city near the Dead Sea, which cites the original Tel El Hammam paper, which was published in the Scientific Reports Journal and received devastating scholarly criticism. The original paper had 21 authors, the paper citing it has 20, and almost every author of the first paper was also an author of the second, a clear case of self-citation. But look at the way the original paper is cited in the second paper. The authors of the second paper start their abstract with the sentence, quote, a previous study presented evidence supporting the hypothesis that a low-altitude airburst approximately 3,600 years ago destroyed Tall El Hammam, a Middle Bronze Age city northeast of the Dead Sea in modern-day Jordan, end quote. Not only did the authors of the second paper make absolutely no mention of the fact that the earlier paper was completely annihilated by post-publication peer review, they also failed to mention that the journal which originally published it made a statement a month later critiquing the paper formally and explaining why it had failed to provide evidence for its claims. Yet the later paper in Air Bursts and Cratering Impacts not only cites this paper as having been scientifically valid and successful in proving its arguments, it relies on the paper's arguments as evidence for its own. This is very clear evidence that the journal's self-citation practice is unethical and self-serving. So it seems no one is paying any attention to this journal paper other than the authors themselves, who are citing it in their own papers published in the same journal. Now, we could conclude that the paper isn't receiving any scholarly attention because it's in a very small and new journal, but there's clear evidence it's because the paper just isn't good quality. How can I make such a judgment without reading and assessing the entire paper for myself? Because I trust the judgment of specialists who have already read it. Which specialists? The specialists who reviewed the paper when it was submitted to 2 other journals, both of which rejected it as unworthy of publication. Those specialists. And what did the paper's authors do in response? They took their paper to a journal which they knew would treat it favorably, and they knew that because 3 of the authors are editors of the actual journal, and because 11 out of the 25 authors credited by the paper are members of the organization which publishes the journal, and because of the journal's record of bias in favor of their hypothesis. This is academic nepotism. Why you shouldn't trust pseudo-archaeologists. Dan Richards, the YouTuber who spoke so highly of this paper, is an electrician by trade, and I'm a technical writer by trade. That means neither of us have the academic and professional background necessary to assess this paper on its scientific merits. I don't know any more about airburst science than Dan does. However, we both have our biases. I know from Dan's videos that he accepts the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, whereas I reject it. This means he was already predisposed to accept the paper, whereas I was predisposed to reject it. That made me more skeptical and therefore more inclined to scrutinize the article closely. I'm also a qualified and experienced information professional. I've been both a university researcher and university lecturer, and I've had some of my own work published in peer-reviewed journals, so I'm considerably more familiar with academic processes and publications than Dan. That's less to praise me and more to excuse Dan from blame for not figuring out the paper he promoted was unreliable, and the journal in which it was published was also unreliable. There's no reason why he would have known how to scrutinize the journal and paper the way I did. On the other hand, there's no reason why he couldn't have learned, quite quickly and quite easily, to do exactly what I did. There are plenty of free online guides describing the process and resources I've used. They're particularly easy to find on university library websites. So Dan didn't need the same formal qualifications and academic experience I have in order to have done this himself. But I don't think he even thought to subject this journal and paper to this level of scrutiny, and there's a reason why I think that. Something else which is important to understand about this situation is the fact that Dan is a self-described pseudo-archaeologist. In a video entitled Open Letter to Society for American Archaeology President, published on the 8th of July 2024, Dan explained, quote, "As you have no doubt guessed by now, I am an alternate historian. As a matter of fact, I happily call myself a pseudoscientist, as I form a hypothesis, research it enough to satisfy myself, and then put that claim out into the world. By not following the same rigorous processes that an archaeologist would, I am engaging in a form of pseudo-archaeology," end quote. Dan is absolutely to be credited with intellectual honesty for making such a statement. Once you know this, you know exactly what you're getting when you view his content, because he has explained his biases very plainly. So why did Dan promote this paper so enthusiastically, and why does he support the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis? As I mentioned previously, Dan believes the land of Atlantis was a real historical place which was destroyed by a cataclysmic event, and the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, if true, would provide scientific evidence for that cataclysm, supporting his beliefs about Atlantis. Other pseudo-archaeologists who believe in the historicity of Atlantis, such as Graham Hancock, often appeal to the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis as evidence for their beliefs. Dan likes the paper because it supports something he already believes and gives him some apparently scientifically credible ammunition to criticize the mainstream archaeologists who dismiss the historical existence of Atlantis as mythology. It should be noted that the scientific version of the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis has been published and discussed in scholarly literature since at least 2007. Though the basic idea has its roots in a 19th century book by American Congressman Ignatius Donnelly, a story for another time. Since its emergence in scientific literature in 2007, the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis has failed to establish itself as a valid hypothesis and has been comprehensively rejected by scholars in the relevant fields. That will change if sufficient evidence is found to support it, but to date the case has not been made, and the available evidence contradicts it. Now, I have my own biases, as I've acknowledged. I was biased towards rejecting the paper Dan promoted because it's arguing in support of a fringe hypothesis which has yet to be established on any firm evidence and which has been comprehensively rejected by the overwhelming majority of relevant scholars. I'm a lot more inclined to side with the scientific consensus than I am to side with a fringe belief without indisputable scientific evidence. That's my bias. However, I apply the same level of scrutiny to reports of information I am biased towards accepting that I do towards reports of information I am biased towards rejecting, which is why I took so much time to scrutinize this article and the journal in which it was published, instead of just dismissing them out of hand on the assumption they weren't worth looking at. I've even made this lengthy video to explain my process of scrutiny in detail. I am not only actively aware of my bias, I take deliberate steps to counteract it, and I do so by applying the scientific method, academic standards, and procedures such as checking scholarly consensus and peer review. This doesn't guarantee I'm going to be right or that I won't make mistakes. Instead, the aim of all this is to reduce the possibility that I am fooling myself, being led astray by my own bias. To give Dan his due credit, it should be noted that he is not immune to critique or changing his mind. In fact, you'll find several videos on his channel in which he issues retractions of claims he had made previously, or in which he announces a change of view. But the most important point to realize here is the fact that Dan's lack of scientific process, lack of archaeological knowledge, qualifications, and training, and lack of familiarity with standard academic processes makes him demonstrably less reliable on archaeology than people who do follow the scientific method, who do have relevant archaeological knowledge, qualifications, and training, and who are familiar with standard academic processes. We've seen a clear example of this throughout this video, and if you look at the videos in which Dan has made retractions, you'll find consistently that those situations are the result of Dan making claims about an area on which he just wasn't properly informed, a subject well outside his own knowledge and expertise. For example, in his video, I Made a Mistake, Let's Learn From It, retraction of DNA video of the 12th of August 2024, Dan explains he made mistaken claims about DNA, saying, quote, "I got a lot of stuff wrong, man. Basically, one video of mine was like completely wrong. It was outdated information," end quote. Later, he elaborates, quote, "That video was outdated. And that's the first thing I want to mention is this was information that was outdated because I already knew it. So when I went and looked the stuff up, I just research bias, I guess you would call it. I knew what I was looking for. I knew these facts. I already knew this stuff. I've known it for years. Well, that's why it's outdated, Dan," end quote. So he made a video using information which was outdated. He didn't check to see if his information was still current. And as a result, he made a mistake. Similarly, in his 21st of May 2023 video entitled A Retraction, Two Apologies, and a Rant, Debunking Channel Update, Dan explained, quote, "I gave you guys some wrong information on my video about the interior of the pyramids. I said that no other place that a pharaoh was intended to be buried was devoid of funerary inscriptions, and that's not true. The first dynasty mastabas and the mastaba for Shepseskaf all have no inscriptions," end quote. Again, in his 19th of September 2024 video entitled I Was Wrong About Ben's Ancient Egyptian Vases, Uncharted X, Dan explained how he had made a mistake about the measurement method used by the owners of the channel Uncharted X in their assessment of some Egyptian vases. Dan not only acknowledged he was wrong, but described how several people had corrected him, and one of them was particularly helpful, having, quote, mentioned it to me that I had this a little bit wrong, and they just kind of poked me in the right direction, end quote. I have linked all these videos in my video's description so you can view them for yourself to get all the details. In each of these cases, Dan was making claims about an area on which he just wasn't properly informed, a subject well outside his own knowledge and expertise, and that's why he made each mistake. In each of them, he was corrected by people who had the relevant knowledge. In each case, Dan graciously accepted the correction, changed his view, and informed his audience. So when you see a tweet or video from a pseudo-archaeologist like Dan, or Graham Hancock, or Robert Sepper, or Bright Insight, or Ancient Origins, or Uncharted X, or Illegitimate Scholar, or any of the others you can find online, remember they don't have the same knowledge, qualifications, and training as the specialists whose views they challenge or dismiss. They're not playing by the same rules as scholars in the field. They don't hold their views to the same standards of evidence. They don't follow the scientific method. They're typically unfamiliar with standard academic processes and procedures. They're not just biased, but less equipped to counter their own biases. And as a result of all this, they are considerably less reliable than the mainstream specialists whose views they challenge. View their content with care, check it against specialist knowledge, and be particularly skeptical of them when they make claims without any evidence. And if they do provide anything they claim is evidence, in particular scholarly journal articles, take care to scrutinize that evidence, as I've shown in this video. They may be misleading you, even in good faith, either because they've misunderstood what they're reading, or because their source is unreliable and they don't know, since they haven't done the due diligence necessary to check this.